No, thank you very much. I was saying welcome back one more Sunday.
So I was saying I'm going to approach it somewhat, the question mark around a black capitalist class in South Africa, around the whole issue of the challenge of funding the struggle, right? So in 1978, a younger Thabo Mbeki addressed a progressive audience in Canada. I think it was at a university, but it would have been a sort of anti-apartheid type audience in Canada. And in the course of the speech, he posed the question whether the struggle in South Africa involved, in the beginning of capitalism, are lamentably absent in the colonial world and post-colonial world. In its beginnings, the national bourgeoisie of the colonial countries identifies itself with the decadent. I do not think it is jumping ahead. In fact, it's beginning at the end. It is already senile before it has come to know the petulance, the fearlessness, or the will to succeed of youth. Okay, so next slide. So having quoted that in his speech, Mbeki then went on, agreeing with Fanon, and said, thus black capitalism, instead of being the antithesis of Western capitalism, is rather confirmation of parasitism, with no redeeming features whatsoever, without any extenuating circumstances to excuse its existence. Now, the older Jeremy Cronin, and certainly the older Mbeki, well, certainly the older Jeremy Cronin would agree, and I think many of you would agree, that both Fanon and the younger Mbeki are onto something here. I mean, we're all too familiar locally with a particular stratum of black capitalists mimic the decadence of the bourgeoisie of the West. You know, we see that in the leadership of much of the leadership of the EFF, for instance, but also the MPCs and many others. Fancy watches and garages full of 30 fancy cars and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, but I think that what one should say is that the judgment is too sweeping. In South Africa, there are, in fact, thousands of black capitalists and petty capitalists who, against many odds, both racist odds, but also the odds of a society in which there's a highly monopolized, very centralized economy. Against these odds, they've succeeded in building businesses. And the better ones, typically without any assistance from the ANC or government or whatever, through special tenders and so on. But we should acknowledge that. So not every emerging black capitalist and petty capitalist in South Africa, I think would fall foul of the parasitism with which Fanon and the early Mbeki were talking about. But nonetheless, it does talk into something of a reality. Next slide. Okay, so that's what Mbeki was saying in 1978. 21 years later, he was saying exactly the opposite. So in November 1999, for instance, he addressed the AGM of the Black Management Forum, and he said that the ANC must remain what it has been for many decades, as if this historically has always been the ANC position and always his position. It must be a movement for the elimination of the legacy of the system of racism. And as part of the realization of the aim to eradicate racism in our country, we must strive to create and strengthen a black capitalist class. Okay. So why the U-turn? Well, I think there are many factors, and I will talk about some of the factors, but I think perhaps the most important is the big challenge that Mbeki, the ANC, all of us were facing about how to fund a progressive political movement, the ANC, but also the party and others, in a capitalist society, especially involving multi-party electoral politics, which cost millions and millions and millions, or appear to do that. So earlier, the ANC's source of funding, in the 1950s, when the ANC really started to become a broad mass movement, it relied largely on the financial support from black professionals and traders, including obviously Indian business people and so on, and some white Democrats and communists. So, I mean, for instance, the Lillesley farm in Rivonia was bought with SACP funds by Goldreich and Harold Warpy, tapped into by the party from basically supportive, progressive white professionals and business people. After the 1960 banning and launch of MK, in those very early in that very early period of the 60s, great hopes were vested by the ANC in particular of receiving military and also financial support from the newly independent states and from the Organization of African Unity. And this was a key purpose of Mandela's well-known 1962 tour of the continent. And what he met was with a great deal of disappointment, partly because the PAC had gone out before and had basically portrayed the ANC as a sellout organization working with whites in South Africa and so forth. And in Tanzania, for instance, it was suggested to him that the MK should delay its armed struggle, postpone it until Sobukwe had been released. And in Ghana, although the PAC had met with Kwame Nkrumah, the president, Mandela was denied an audience with Nkrumah and was given a lecture by a minister that the ANC was a tribalist organization and so on. So in that period, then the ANC, there was a big debate inside of the ANC about how to position ourselves, and particularly given this lack of sympathy, actually, from where we had expected to get sympathy for our armed struggle to overthrow white minority rule. So the ANC, there was a big debate inside of the ANC, basically, but it said, look, for the purposes of acceptance in Africa, which was identified at that point as the key source of resourcing, we should adopt an African image and project an African image. But that agenda actually proved disappointing for many reasons, and basically because of the weaknesses, confusions in the newly independent colonial countries and so forth, and also just lacking of resources. And so in practice, for most of its exile years, insofar as the majority of the ANC was in exile, or much of it was in exile, the ANC was highly reliant on the generous military, financial, and other assistance from the Soviet bloc, particularly the Soviet Union, but also the GDR, Bulgaria, and other countries in that system. So that through the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s, this was the key source of funding and resourcing, while at the same time the major imperialist countries simply regarded the ANC as a terrorist organization. Okay. So, I mean, the positioning of the major imperialist powers towards Southern Africa was well captured in 1969 by the quite well-known National Security Staff Memo, which was developed in the US. And it remained the strategic document towards Southern Africa of US policy for the next 15 years or so. And it offered a series of options, but the key one, which in practice was implemented, was called the Tar Baby option. And what it advocated was a close US association with both the white and colonial states, because at this stage, Angola and Mozambique were under Portuguese colonial control. Rhodesia, then Zimbabwe was under white minority settler control. Namibia, Southwest Africa was basically under South African administration, and so forth. So it advocated closer association with these white and colonial regimes, but also the newly independent black states. And the objective was to encourage what they called moderation on all sides. But what they said in this Tar Baby option was that while working also with the newly independent states in Southern Africa, the white minority colonial regimes were there to stay, as they put it, and were really the only effective agents for constructive change. So it was that guided US policy. And this continued right through, for instance, Reagan's presidency. He was president between 1981 and 89, and his policy of constructive engagement was very much informed still by the strategic perspective. And it was very similar in the UK, for instance, under Thatcher, who was the prime minister from 1979 until late 1990. And it was only really in September 1986 that in the US, for instance, Congress overrode Reagan's ongoing vetoes of a comprehensive anti-apartheid bill, which allowed for sanctions and so forth. It was only late in the day, in 86, that there was beginnings of a shift in imperialist strategy towards Southern Africa. Okay. So what were the factors behind this recalibration of the imperialist strategy towards South Africa and Southern Africa? Well, first of all, some of the Portuguese colonies had been liberated somewhat. Angola obviously was suffering under a massive civil war. So, no sooner had the tar baby option in the late 80s said that the white minority regimes and colonial regimes were here to stay, then by 1975, they were overthrown in the Portuguese colonies. But a major factor behind the recalibration of the imperialist strategy was the worldwide growth of the anti-apartheid movement. I think as South Africans in the liberation movement, we should never forget the huge role of the anti-apartheid movement. I think many of those who'd been active in it and leading activists in Europe, for instance, feel that they were forgotten, after 1994 by the ANC in particular. And yet played an absolutely critical role and was a major achievement of the ANC itself, and not least O.R. Tambo. It's partly related to that. There was also in the US the growing influence of the Afro-American lobby in US politics. And that's important to mention because obviously while playing a progressive role in terms of having a new approach towards Southern Africa and South Africa, that Afro-American lobby also then had an influence and in some ways a not always positive and progressive influence on evolving ANC policy in the early 1990s around promoting a new black elite and so forth, which had been some of its own politics within the US context. And then obviously a big factor was the waning through the second half of the 1980s of the power of the Soviet bloc on its way to the eventual crisis of 89 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and so forth. And so increasingly from an imperialist perspective, centers of Cold War regional conflict. So the Cold War was so called because the major powers, the Soviet Union and the US, never engaged in a hot war, and thank God for that, a nuclear war. But there were hot wars in many regions, not least here in Southern Africa. I mean, we easily forget as South Africans that over 1 million people died in Southern Africa in the course of the Cold War regional wars, especially in Angola and in Mozambique, and obviously in the rest of Southern Africa as well. So with the waning of the Cold War, as a result also of the weakening of the Soviet bloc influence and capacity, regional gendarmes, regional policemen basically were increasingly not needed. And particularly the apartheid regime was seen now as more of a kind of political embarrassment than a sort of policeman on behalf of US imperialism in the conflicts being waged in Southern Africa. And that then also related to globally with the relative shift, the underlying relative shift from imperialist military domination of the third world using military power to the increasing use of financial instruments, using debt, for instance, public debt of third world countries, structural adjustment programs and so on, to discipline and force post-colonial countries into a pro-imperialist agenda through the management of debt. And we just need to look at our current situation with Fitch and Moody's and so forth, again downgrading us, to see how this has became already by the late 80s and early 90s a key instrument. I say relative because obviously there are some still highly contested areas, particularly oil-rich zones, where clearly the imperialists haven't abandoned military intervention or regional policemen like Israel, Zionist Israel, in their global agendas. Okay, and then of course, above all, and not unlinked to all of the above, in South Africa through the 1980s, from the late 1970s, there was a huge intensification of popular struggle and repression, which was highly recorded and strengthened the global demand for the ending of apartheid, and then the deepening crisis of white minority rule. So all of those played into a recalibration of the imperialist strategy. So the imperialists had all along, sought for a moderate black counterforce to the ANC. or later within the ANC. So in the late 1970s and early 80s, Buthelezi was seen as a potential candidate to provide a kind of Savimbi type alternative to an ANC with a Communist Party ally. And in particular, it seems that West Germany, as it was then, the Federal Republic of Germany, was particularly funding and resourcing Buthelezi quite considerably, but so was Thatcher and others. There was also, of course, the agenda of local monopoly capital in South Africa to support figures like Buthelezi as buffer black leaders that could be a counterpoint to the ANC and its alliance. When I was in the underground producing in the late SACP underground pamphlets, at that time, Buthelezi had a weekly column in the Anglo-American controlled media, the Times media. So they had a weekly column which indicated that they were trying to promote him. The kind of monopoly capital in South Africa was trying to promote him. And so we, producing in the underground, we were producing several thousand pamphlets and setting them off in bucket bombs and mailing them out and so forth. And whenever we were getting the copy, what we were writing from smuggled in from London, basically from the SACP head office. And when there was an attack on Buthelezi, we were always particularly thrilled because the Buthelezi unfailing, and he was on our mailing list, he would unfailingly then respond at great length to what had been said in the underground pamphlets. And so we would get a second stab at a circulation of what we'd been saying in the pamphlets. Anyway, so the Buthelezi was then favored, but then there was an important development in Western Europe and to some extent in the US as well. And that was the emergence in the 1980s of what came to be called third way social democracy. And an earlier proponent of this was Olof Palme, the Swedish prime minister, not so much in his first term, but in his second term, which ran between 1982 and 86 when he was assassinated, possibly by South African operatives. It's a murder that has never been clarified. The Mitterrand was also then became, in the latter half of his French presidency, became a advocate of this kind of third way social democracy and was later taken up by Clinton and Blair, and was very influential on the ANC, by the way, and not least on someone like Mbeki, who had early contacts with Olof Palme in the 1980s. And so I think a lot of the evolution of ANC policy in the 1990s had to do with the growing influence of these kinds of third way social democratic politicians. So the third way was basically attempting to locate itself as beyond both the left and the right, a social democracy that tried to place itself to combine center-right economics, basically neoliberalism on the one hand, with some kind of social consciousness represented in a kind of center-left social policy. So not completely ravaging the welfare systems that had been planted in an earlier period before Reagan and before Thatcher, but toning them down, but complying with a kind of neoliberal center-right economics. Thatcher once, when she was asked what was her proudest achievement, she said her proudest achievement was that she got Tony Blair to adopt all of her policies and implement them in practice. And she was obviously referring to the way in which New Labour, for instance, implemented neoliberalism, austerity. And of course, you can recognize this, as we'll talk later on, as to the kind of reality that we find ourselves in currently, with a kind of dominant center-right neoliberal economic austerity, but with attempts at some kind of trickle-down social policy. Okay. Now these forces led an active engagement with the ANC, and they earlier than the Thatchers and the Reagans realized that sooner or later the ANC would become the ruling party in South Africa. And so they sought to cultivate a non-communist, or perhaps what they would have called a post-communist, moderate leadership inside of the ANC. So that would be major external forces and the way in which they played a role in the eventual negotiated transition, but also impacted on the culture of the ANC and the policy perspectives of the ANC. But inside South Africa as well, both the regime as well as big capital and so on also had from the beginnings sought to cultivate a black elite of one kind or another to buffer against the challenges of the liberation movement. So in the 50s and 60s, obviously the Bantustan policy was conceived as an attempt to build a South African black elite that would displace the liberation movement. So Verwoerd is well remembered for saying the famous quote about Africans being, their only vocation would be to be hewers of wood and haulers of water. But in that same speech, he did say some other things. So first of all, he said, in the European community, okay, above certain forms of labor, the black person has no place. But within his own community, all the doors are open. And for that reason, it is no avail for him to receive a training which has as its aim absorption into the European community where he cannot be absorbed. And so it was this approach which then grounded their funding and resourcing of the so-called Bush colleges under the broader aegis of Bantu education. And the idea was that these Bush colleges would create a new black elite, a leadership, but also a management corps to run a kind of civil service within these Bantustans. And that's important to remember, by the way, because when we talk about the problems of the Sunset Clause of the early 1990s, we think that it was about, which it was to some extent, offering some guarantees to white bureaucrats, the white civil servants inside of the apartheid regime. But it also offered, guarantees and absorbed, I forget the exact figure, but I think it was far more, something like 800,000 civil servants from Bantustans of one kind or another. And, when we look at the challenges of coaching a movement, a state that lacks capacity and so on, when we look at what's going on in the Eastern Cape, for instance, or other provinces in which there were Bantustans, then we need to understand also that, a problem, this attempt to create a kind of black buffer class has also left a legacy into the current South African reality. Okay, I'm not suggesting that all civil servants in the Bantustans were corrupt or whatever, but obviously there was a very poor culture often in those realities. But at least from the late 70s and into the 80s, the more enlightened elements within the ruling bloc realized that one couldn't just focus on the Bantustans. One needed to address an emerging, or the possibility to create an urban black elite that could be counterposed to the influence of the ANC and its liberation movement. And so the IDT, which still exists, by the way, and in crisis basically, was set up, the Independent Development Trust. Urban Foundation was another major initiative funded partly by big business and supported to some extent by government. And then, of course, there was the 1983 Black Local Authorities elections and the tricameral parliament. So again, an attempt to create a sort of political black buffer stratum, and so on. Of course, this was too little too late, and precisely that 1983 intervention became the reason for and the opportunity that was grabbed, and that was why the UDF was launched, the United Democratic Front, in April of 1983 to oppose this attempt and to successfully boycott these attempts to set up these alternative structures. Okay. And so from at least 1985, monopoly capital, in particular Anglos, also big Afrikaner capital and so forth, began to realize that no, we've actually got to, these attempts to bypass the ANC are going to fall flat. We need to probe into the ANC and to begin to focus on finding, developing, and cultivating quote unquote doves, as they would call them, within the ANC. Okay, Letiz is just blocking my thing, but basically Iddasa, Van Zyl-Slabbert, and other forces were involved in these initiatives and led the process. Okay, and in that obviously played a progressive role, a partly progressive role in opening up the possibilities for an engagement with the ANC and laying the basis for what became the negotiation. Now, what was prompting monopoly capital was, apart from the appreciation that the political initiatives by the National Party regime to find alternatives to the ANC were not working, was their own problem, economic problem. So, South Africa had a relatively significant, quite powerful certainly for an African country, for a third world country, a significant monopoly sector. But through the 80s, it was cut off from pursuing the globalization freeway in pursuit of high profits in low-wage economies in the Far East and so forth, which is what their counterparts were doing around the world. So part of what Thatcher and Reagan had done was to break the old social contracts, social accords in Western Europe, for instance, where instead of there being social accords between big business, the labor movement, and a social democratic, let's say, or a labor party, with the crisis in Western Europe, well, a global capitalist crisis from the early 1970s, basically neoliberalism became the new vogue, and part of that was pushed by monopoly capital in those countries, developed northern countries, which no longer wanted to be bound into welfare, taxation, social accords with trade unions and so on. And having recovered from the Second World War, wanted now to pursue low-wage economies elsewhere in the world. In China, which had begun to open up now with the reforms, the Deng Xiaoping reforms, in South Korea, later on in Vietnam, and then with the collapse of Eastern Europe, obviously then in Eastern European countries as well. But our monopoly capital was locked in and couldn't easily pursue this globalization and financialization. And they were locked in by the success of the anti-apartheid struggle. So there were financial, economic, oil, arms, and other sanctions imposed on capital inside South Africa. And then further crippling them and frustrating them was all the defensive measures that the apartheid state had to take. So they imposed very tough exchange controls. You couldn't get your money out very easily. There were two rands. There was a rand and then a financial rand, which you could use to invest outside, but that was very tightly constrained. The apartheid regime applied very strict prescribed assets on capital, and particularly on finance capital. X amount of money had to be invented, a percentage of profit, of surplus had to be invested into particular prescribed assets. And there was quite heavy corporate tax and so forth. And so this forced South African monopoly capital to invest locally. And what they did was there was a huge process of conglomeration. So mining houses invested in forestry and agriculture and in retail. The retail sector invested in agriculture and so on. So there was huge diversification. Somewhere in the 1980s, I read somewhere that one of these big giants, conglomerated giants, in a whole lot of sectors, not even just one sector, was Barlow Rand. And apparently Barlow Rand had the second largest number of employees of any company in the world at this time. And that reflected just the fact that they had to conglomerate. They couldn't get their money out and so forth, and invest surplus elsewhere. And ironically, and I think maybe we need to think about this, are the conditions, obviously in some ways they are much more favorable, in some ways the conditions for trade union organization in the industrial sector in particular, became more favorable from the mid-1980s than they are perhaps now, when capital has huge mobility, and if workers go on strike and so on, then they just disinvest and move elsewhere, whatever. And so it's no accident that something like COSATU, before which COSATU obviously launched as very powerful trade unions. South African monopoly capital was forced to find an accommodation with the South African working class. And I think that also, looking back, this also led to certain workerist and syndicalist and social accord illusions within the labor movement and the broader progressive movement, that we could do business. We had a valid interlocutor in South African monopoly capital. I'm not saying we shouldn't interlocute with South African, we have to, with South African monopoly capital, but I think the reality that it was penned into South Africa created conditions which no longer exist. So all of this laid the basis in South Africa for negotiations. And I think what was not sufficiently appreciated as we went into the negotiations was that there were two very different strategic agendas at play. And when I say that there were some illusions about social accords and so forth, particularly on the economic front, I'm thinking of this. So I think that the ANC, I've said ANC moderates, but perhaps it was all of us in varying degrees, thought that we could replicate in my view, very progressive political and constitutional accord, so social accord, if you like, with a economic and social accord with monopoly capital as well. So that would be parallel with, just as we'd settlement on the constitutional front, on the political front, that it would be possible also to achieve a similar economic social accord, an economic CODESA, as some people refer to. And by doing that, and we would be able to do that, and this became the kind of moderate version, by creating an investor-friendly macroeconomic framework that would attract investment and perhaps even Marshall aid, the kind of huge finances that the US poured into Western Europe after the Second World War. And this would produce growth, and that would allow us to have the kind of social redistribution at scale that all of us in the ANC wanted to see. But actually what South African monopoly capital wanted from a post-apartheid government was something quite different, okay? They wanted macroeconomic policy that would remove exchange controls, that would get away with, do away with prescribed assets, that would allow monopoly capital finally in South Africa to globalize, to financialize, to shift huge amounts of capital out of South Africa. And of course, that's what had happened. I mean, billions and billions and billions of legal as well as illegal capital left South Africa from the early 1990s, but increased right until increased something like 20%, 25% of GDP was lost, according to one economist, in 2007, the equivalent of something like 20% of our GDP to capital flight. Okay. They also wanted macro policies that would lock us in to the IMF World Bank discipline. And so that debt basically would be used as a threat, as a leverage to prevent excessive, in their view, public sector debt, to discipline the new democratic state. And so secretly, in late 1993, remember before the elections in 1994, there was a transitional executive council which involved National Party politicians as well as some ANC politicians in the transitional executive council. Secretly in 1993, they negotiated, both the National Party bunch and the ANC bunch, an IMF loan of $850 million US. It wasn't really a loan that was needed. It wasn't particularly needed, the money. But the real agenda was contained in the letter of intent that was accompanied the request for the loan, in which the Transitional Executive Council promised wage restraint, inflation targeting, and trade and industrial liberalization in the new South Africa. I remember I only became aware, so I was elected onto the NEC in 1991, ANC NEC. And I heard from some comrades, I think it was from Patrick Bond actually, was I aware of this IMF loan that had been taken out in 1993? So I raised the matter in an NEC, it must have been in 92, 93 or whatever. And I remember Madiba up on the platform, the podium, looking really shocked and surprised, and turned to the other officials at the top desk. They didn't seem to know. And eventually Tito Mboweni, who had obviously been involved in this, stood up from the back of the NEC. He always used to sit at the back of the NEC. And said, no, there was this IMF loan. It was just a small loan. It didn't amount to anything and so on. So he knew all about it and had obviously been involved in the TEC process. And of course, that's exactly what he's done again with the loan that we've got at the beginning of the year, which we didn't need, the so-called COVID loan, in which also there was all kinds of promises made, which weren't required by the COVID loan, special COVID loan. Okay, so behind monopoly capital and the kind of more liberal end of the non-ANC was an agenda which was well expressed by Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert, who also played in his way a sort of progressive role, encouraging negotiations and so on. But it was very much about encouraging an elite pacting negotiation. So in 1992, he said, one of the most daunting challenges that will face the future government, obviously an ANC government, will be to protect the new political space that will have been created by the negotiations from being used to contest the historical imbalances that precipitated the negotiations in the first place. So, I mean, how cynical can you get? What he's saying is, you know, what we must do is make sure that we get a kind of liberal constitutional settlement, one person, one vote, and so forth. But at the same time, the new government will have to make sure that the space that is opened up, the political space that's opened up by that, is not used then to contest the historical imbalances. What are we talking about? All the social and economic so-called imbalances, huge inequalities that ravage our society, that they, you know, the struggle for them shouldn't, you know, those shouldn't be disturbed, essentially was what's being said. So to drive this agenda, there was also, and I think that, you know, looking back, you know, sometimes as the left, we think, gosh, you know, we kind of lost a whole lot of rounds in the 1990s. And I think we did okay. And it was not necessarily that we didn't try or that we weren't fighting and so on, but we were up against a huge range of forces, monopoly capital in South Africa, global international capital, at a time when the left was off balance, basically, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, amongst other things. Okay. So a lot of effort also went in this period into what we might call the ideological cultivation of an ANC neoliberal cadre. Okay, so for instance, I mean, just to name one example, in the early 1990s, Tito Mboweni, Maria Ramos, and Lesetja Kganyago, among others, all underwent so-called training at the notorious investment bank Goldman Sachs. For those of you who don't know Goldman Sachs, I'm sure you all know of Goldman Sachs, but I mean, they are, you know, amongst the kind of worst of the economic hitmen around, global hitmen. I mean, they were the ones that advised the Greek government prior to the massive crisis in Greece, and then bet against the advice that they'd given and made billions out of the crisis in Greece, for instance. And Tito later, when he was appointed as an advisor in 2010 to Goldman Sachs, at the time when he was the chair of Anglo Gold Ashanti, remembered fondly, basically, that he'd been to Goldman Sachs. Yes, he said, I've known these folks for a long time. And when it was not fashionable, they opened their doors to young ANC economists and took them for training in New York, as if it was some kind of generous, you know, bursary that had been given. I mean, this was a hard-nosed attempt to develop a particular kind of neoliberal-oriented cadre, not without success, as we can see inside of the ANC. Also, we began to see early, what we later called BEE moves, Black Economic Empowerment moves. I didn't know this, but I then read it later in Mark Gevisser's biography of Thabo Mbeki. Apparently in November of 1990, Mbeki tried to sneak the beginnings of what we later call BE policy into the ANC, into an NEC meeting of the ANC, under the cover of a document which was calling for the phasing out of sanctions. But according to Gavissa, the attempt to, in 1990, the suggestion that the ANC should call for the international community to end sanctions was so unpopular in the NEC that the suggestion that that there should also be some kind of BE in exchange for that, presumably that monopoly capital in South Africa would, in exchange for having sanctions loosened, would then also create space, shares, or some kind of ownership for selected Black individuals. So that got chucked out as well. The way Gavissa portrays it makes it sound like it was two different things, that he was proposing, let's phase out the sanctions, but in doing that, what we can do is maybe also negotiate some kind of BE. But the things are linked, basically. You know, it was a kind of negotiation. Let's leverage phasing out sanctions in exchange for a slice of the capitalist pie, basically, was being proposed. Now, can you imagine if, I mean, no wonder, I mean, you get a sense of the many debates and struggles that were going on inside of the ANC in the negotiations period, which is often forgotten, I think. But so in 1990, so negotiations have hardly got underway in November of 1990. And one of the few weapons we've got, because we've moved towards suspending the armed struggle, one of the few weapons and pressure points that we've still got, apart from mass mobilization on the regime and on monopoly capital, was the persistence of sanctions. And yet, you know, already Mbeki was proposing that we should throw that leverage away. It would have been incredibly, you know, we wouldn't have got the kind of negotiated deal that we did eventually get if we'd done it at that point. Okay, but although it didn't work, that Mbeki proposal didn't work then. Monopoly capital was also beginning now to look at how to approach the new or the looming new political reality that sooner or later the ANC clearly was going to be the ruling party. And so a young Michael Spicer, who's still around, I think, at Anglo, was asked to look at what had Anglo done back in the early 1950s after the National Party had won elections. Because what Anglo had done was that they, in order to accommodate the new political reality, to change a little bit, but so as not to have to transform radically, was that they disposed of some of their mines, general mining basically, to Afrikaner business. In other words, to kind of make peace with the emerging Afrikaner business. And so Michael Spicer's conclusion was that what they'd done, what Anglo had smartly done in order to accommodate Anglo capital with the new emerging Afrikaner political reality, was also a useful approach to accommodate the new ANC reality that was coming in the early 1990s. And so quite early on, before 1994, African Life was sold from the Anglo stable to Don Ngube. Industrial assets of Anglo were packaged into Jonic and sold, the same with JCI and so on, although carefully they kept their platinum interests and didn't let those go. Okay. So, yeah, okay. And Afrikaner capital or capitalists were also not to be left out. So apparently Ntata Matlana had approached Anglo also to try and get a deal out of them and was turned down. But he bumped into the then Minister of Tourism, Och Marais, who said, you know, forget about the English, come and do business with us, the Afrikaners, and ours is MetLife. And that deal was the origins of NAIL, which then later on drew in Ramaphosa, Dikgang Moseneke, Sake Makazoma, and others. Okay. So you can see that the first wave of what we would later have called BE deals were actually driven not by the ANC, although Mbeki had tried, but by established monopoly capital, who saw this as a way of changing a little bit so as not to have to change a lot. basically, to make accommodation. But it also coincided very usefully with their post-sanctions move, okay? Because remember what I was saying is that because they'd been locked into South Africa by sanctions, basically, they had built these huge, unwieldy, problematic, and not very profitable conglomerates. And now, in line with neoliberal, the neoliberal trim, what they wanted to do was to deconglomerate and to focus on their core businesses and their core profit centers. And they also wanted to increase financialization. And so BE, these early drives to BE suited that agenda very well as well, that strategic agenda, because what they deconglomerated by passing over the mines that were less profitable or sections of their business that they were less interested in. And also these deals were highly leveraged. They were basically shares on loan. So it also benefited the increasing financialization of the South African economy, with the financial sector and all of those huge legal firms in Sandton with their huge headquarters and so on. They were key beneficiaries of the financial transactions that were required, complicated transactions that went into these BE deals. Okay. But another interesting route for the early wave of BE occurred in new sectors that were opening up, and or in sectors that had been heavily regulated by the National Party and were now being re-regulated and liberalized. So the most obvious one was the opening up of the spectrum in 1993 and the huge opening up of the cell phone industry. There was also the kind of liberalization of broadcasting and also of gambling. And key players in this space were Motlana, but also individuals associated, interestingly, with the investment arms of unions. Copeland in particular, linked to SACTU and his HCI, Marcel Golding from NUM, and the the Mine Workers Investment Corporation. But also Close and Becky Associates, Swatsungonyama, Andile, who was the DG in communications, Andile, whatever. Looking back, there's some evidence that NUM and SACTU, through their investment arms, were early movers in the space. Other unions tried to get into it, but were slow movers and not so effective. And I think that both HCI and MIC had benefits for NUM, for the workers in NUM, and for SACTU, although also lots of benefits for Johnny Copeland and Marcel Golding and those associated with him. Personal, wealth and so forth, but they did pass on resources and bursaries and things like that and funding into NUM and SACTU. But of course, even there, we need to ask whether the South African majority benefited. We've got cell phones and some union-associated investment arms got very rich out of the process, but the cost of data in South Africa is hugely expensive. Golding and Copeland were involved in some of the new broadcasting, private, for-profit radio stations and so on. And that some of that resources probably also assisted NUM and SACTU. But what has been the impact of privatizing lots of broadcasting on, for instance, the public broadcaster, the crisis that we're facing in the present? So in short, whose agenda was this BE? Was it monopoly capital or the agenda of the ANC democratic government? For foreign investors and South African monopoly capital, finding black partners through BE deals, amongst others, was a means to accessing the ruling party, to tenders, and so forth. For the ANC, the argument was twofold. The first argument was that by actively promoting a black so-called patriotic bourgeoisie, we would have a more reliable source of party funding. We couldn't rely, and you can understand why we felt this, couldn't rely on Anglo-American or Rembrandt van Rijn and so forth, to Remgro and so forth, to be our principal funders. So the argument was that we're in a capitalist society dominated by this. In capitalist societies, elections, multi-party elections are hugely expensive. Where are we going to get the resources? So we need very quickly to promote those with wealth that can do so. But the second argument was also that which was, in my view, a revisionist argument, was that a black capitalist class, so-called, was an inherent part of the National Democratic Revolution. Okay, but from an ANC perspective, things quickly became quite complicated, which was acknowledged. So in that same speech that I referred to earlier, to the Black Management Forum that Mbeki made, he implicitly referred to the problem that they weren't getting the support they were hoping to from the broad ANC and its broader alliance with this agenda. And so he urged the BMF, which obviously would have been a more ready audience for this. He said, we must abandon our embarrassment about the possibility of the emergence of successful and therefore prosperous black owners of productive property. So he's psychologizing what was a substantive concern and critique within the movement. He's saying, you know, it's just kind of an embarrassment. But the embarrassment was a reflection that it was not, you know, that people getting very rich, and particularly selected individuals like a Smuts Ngonyama, whatever, from the presidency, becoming the key beneficiaries of this, created lots of havoc. Okay, but you can see the beginning. So later on, when Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who was then the Minister of Minerals and Energy, I think, mineral resources, said blacks should not be ashamed to be filthy rich, or Smuts Ngonyama said, I didn't struggle to be poor, those infamous statements that were made. But you can see that they were encouraged by Mbeki saying, you know, let's abandon this embarrassment. So the ANC continued, or these forces inside the ANC continued to battle in terms of programmatically and strategically to explain what they were doing in this active promotion of a black capitalist, what they called a black capitalist class, a standalone black capitalist class. Okay. And so one of the ways that it happened was that, I haven't done it here, but if you follow the progress of ANC strategy and tactics documents, whether you go all the way back to Morogoro or you look from 1991 onwards, then you'll see the way in which motive forces are defined. So in the early 1990s, basically the ANC says, in national terms, the key motive forces are blacks in general and the Africans in particular. And in terms of social or class forces, it's the working class that is the key motive force, but also professionals and small business people and so on are also, you know, have an interest in aligning themselves with the working class. But increasingly, the number of class/social so-called motive forces increased. So in the ANC's discussion paper for its July 2000 NGC, the number of motive forces had multiplied to 6: the working class, the unemployed, the rural masses, the women, middle classes, and black capitalists. Okay, and you can see, in order to turn the so-called black capitalists into a motive force, a key motive force of the National Democratic Revolution, what this document starts to do is it muddles classes with other social categories, women and rural masses. It muddles classes with strata. For instance, it separates workers from the unemployed and the underemployed as if the latter were also not part of the proletariat. And above all, it confuses self-interest with capacity to advance the NDR. The whole notion of a motive force is about what do we focus on as the liberation movement? What forces not only have an interest in change, but also the capacity for thoroughgoing radical transformation. Okay. But increasingly then in ANC documents, basically anyone with an interest in deracialization becomes a motive force. Okay, regardless of their capacity to drive a serious national democratic revolution. The other way, yeah, so also then they try to embody this notion of a so-called black capitalist class as a key component of the national democratic revolution. I think I've quoted this before in an earlier lecture that I gave to Jack Simons, but in a discussion document of 1998, the State, Property Relations and Social Transformation, a grouping around Mbeki basically developed this. And it says the state in its procurement policy, its programs of restructuring assets, i.e. through privatization, using instruments of empowerment, pressure and other measures, must promote or promotes the emergence of a black capitalist class. So back then in 1997, 98, the party came in tripartite, in summits and so forth, alliance summits and so forth. We raised very clearly the two questions in regard to the strategic agenda. The first was that, look, South Africa already has a developed capitalist economy and a long-established South African, indigenous, if you like, capitalist class, national class. Of course, it's overwhelmingly white and male, we said, and it remains so. But we said we a standalone black capitalist class to be forged, that there could be black capitalists. There were already, and there could be more. And there was no reason why capitalists should be white and male, or overwhelmingly white and male. But the idea that there would be a separate class in itself and for itself, a black capitalist class, we said, we didn't think that would be the case. And even if it were possible for there to be such a class, we didn't believe that it was capable late in the day, as Cabral, as Fanon said so well in that earlier quote. This would be a capitalist class arriving late on the scene, a highly developed capitalist, skewed but highly developed capitalist economy. They would be unlikely to be able to drive technological modernization and broad economic development. So, what we argued is that essentially to create a new strata, new capitalists, generally they require some form of primary or primitive accumulation to enter into the process of expanded capitalist accumulation. You might want to be a capitalist, but unless you've got capital, you can't. You're not a capitalist, and you can't become a capitalist. And we argued then in 1997, 1998 that generally speaking, new fractions of the capitalist class, certainly in South Africa, could only emerge substantively through indebted shareholding, through existing monopoly route, with all the dangers of fronting, compradorism, being very dependent or closely associated with the agenda of inevitably of monopoly capital, or alternately by looting of public resources, what we call parasitism, what later became state capture. Now, very interestingly, in 1998, in that paper, in the engagements in the alliance, the Mbeki grouping conceded this. They said that while these forces, they're talking about the emergent black capitalist class, will be direct beneficiaries of the NDR in their view, they can easily be co-opted, they conceded this, into the agendas of their white counterparts, and they can also easily become a source of corruption within the state. So this was a prophetic concession, but basically the Mbeki paper and then the strategy and tactics document the year later, or 1998, of the ANC, basically said, but that's why the ANC leadership of these forces is critical. But as we look now at the scene of what looks like a lot of devastation in the ANC and in our country, who is leading whom? Is the ANC providing effective and disciplining leadership of these forces, or is it a bit the other way around? Okay, so instead of resourcing the ANC, which it does, obviously, to a degree, BE starts to resource individuals who become very wealthy. And so some pocket money might end up with the ANC, and if we're lucky, even with the SACP. But more and more, it starts to resource individuals and factions associated with those individuals within the ANC itself. And the ANC quickly, in my view, lost control over the process. And this has now spun back in very problematic ways into the ANC. I mean, we could see it early. I mean, this was one early evidence in 2001, when Police Minister Steve Tshwete announced that Ramaphosa, Toke Sexwale, and Matthews Phosa were plotting against Mbeki, okay? And this was the police minister saying this. And clearly, you can see what's happening here is that the Ramaphosa, Sexwale, and Matthews Phosa had been beneficiaries of BE deals with monopoly capital and also imperialist capital. And this was a source of concern to the Mbeki circle, that their independent access to wealth would also become then the source of political campaigning inside of the ANC at their expense, okay, creating the sense of insecurity. And of course, still today, from the RET side, the so-called the kind of Zumaites, this allegation, obviously directed at Ramaphosa, that he's working on behalf of foreign interests or white monopoly capital and so on. So that allegation and thing is, has ancient history. It goes back to the Mbeki period and to someone who was very close to Mbeki, Steve Tshwete. Also, I mean, this also led the other tensions were that there were many aspirants. When Phumzile said, get filthy rich. So a lot of people thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. But not everybody could be accommodated within the formal BE deals. And that led then to, increasing illegal approaches to parasitism. At first, it was largely concentrated around provincial bosses and the ANC youth with Kebble. But this eventually evolved into full-blown, what we've called state capture of the Gupta years. Next slide. Okay, so the argument you can hear that I'm trying to develop, and which you should debate and agree and disagree with, is that these two primary accumulation trajectories have consolidated now into the two dominant tendencies. Perhaps they're factions in the ANC leadership at least, and perhaps through much of the ANC. On the one side, a state capture parasitic faction flying the false flag of radical economic transformation, and a kind of third wayist, neoliberal, arguably compradorist tendency of faction. And this is why the SACP, in my view, has characterized the current struggle as a struggle on two fronts, against corruption on the one hand, but also against neoliberal austerity on the other. And and I'm approaching an end, I know I've gone on quite long, what progress have we made in this agenda of a struggle on two fronts? I think that we're seeing steady but slow progress on the anti-corruption front. And in doing that, we're working with what we might call the neoliberal austerity third wayist grouping or tendency, including Treasury, including Tito Mboweni and others, who are friends in the struggle against corruption, but whose approach to our economic and therefore social policy is basically imposing neoliberal austerity. And on that front, we're not making much struggle at all. Next slide. Okay, this is a qualification which maybe I can jump over, but essentially what I do want to, I should have made it earlier basically, but I don't think that as we're criticizing BE and compradorism and parasitism and so on, we're not saying that black capitalists individually or collectively are necessarily bad people any more than white capitalists, but there are systemic limitations to being a capitalist. And Saki Matozoa expressed this very well. When people complain that having climbed the ladder of BE, he is not assisting others, he said, but how do you expect me to behave any differently from other capitalists? If I did, I would soon be out of business. So there are laws of accumulation within the capitalist system. If you go with them, you get out-competed, you get out-drummed. So although, you might give some pocket money to the ANC or even the SACP or COSATU or whatever, basically you in order to sustain your accumulation process, you've got to behave like a capitalist, whether you're black, white, or any other color, whether you're male or female. It's also important to say that obviously the SACP supports the Freedom Charter to call to remove all racial and gendered restrictions on rights to trade and so on. We support we're not the DA, okay, not the DA in its current version particularly. We're not, we are fully supportive of a wide range of targeted affirmative action measures that take into account race, gender, class, and so on, employment equity, land reform, NUSFAS, black industrialist programs, state support for co-ops and SMMEs, the township economy, recognition of prior learning, all of those things and much more, okay. But our position in regard to the capitalist class is that insofar as we are in a capitalist society, we support state intervention to compel and incentivize patriotic behavior by capitalists. We don't expect black capitalists because they're black to be patriotic spontaneously. And we do expect white capitalists who are benefiting from the resources of our country to behave patriotically. They won't do so spontaneously, whether they're black or white, and that requires incentivization, but also discipline, the use of popular power and state power to discipline capital, to get national reindustrialization, to create jobs, to have fixed investment, not just speculative investment on the JSE and other stock exchanges around the world, to have prescribed assets, or what are now called impact investments, to have localization, beneficiation, to actively curb capital flight, base erosion using offshore tax havens, illegal transfer pricing, and all of that range of things. Moving along. And this requires, we talk about being a development state. And if you look at real developmental states, whether they are the old social democratic states in Sweden, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, or the Taiwans and South Koreas, basically those development states work with capital, but they discipline capital. And this requires, a state that's prepared to discipline capital and to discipline capital, but reinforced by working class and popular power in mobilization. But unfortunately, too much, going back to Gear, too much emphasis has gone to one and problematic dimension of disciplining capital, which has been enforcing through regulation and legislation various BE requirements. So we tend to enforce those. But for the rest, much of the focus has been on attracting investments, performing, neoliberal gymnastics to be an attractive investment destination. And very little has gone into disciplining capital via prescribed assets, which we simply renounced, tightening up on capital movements, effective enforcement of labor legislation. This is a battle that Komitulas is having in his ministry. The unions are complaining around the COVID measures and so forth, that workers are not being protected by bosses, and where are the labor inspectors? And Komitulas is saying we have simply underinvested massively in labor inspectors. And the unions are saying, oh, that's not good enough. And so on. Tulas is saying, we need the unions to be active in this process, be our ears and eyes and so forth. But, this is another example of a failure to develop the capacity to enforce levels of, in the public interest and working class interest, enforcement and discipline on capital. And so take another example, hidden away in this month's medium-term budget, unremarked basically in most of the media. Tito Mboweni announced that there would be further steps to make cross-border business easier, including inward listings, so-called loop structures, and corporate foreign borrowings. So just a few weeks before, President Ramaphosa had said, we are losing huge amounts of money to illegal and legal outward investment, capital outflows and so forth. We need to tighten up on these things. And what is Mboweni doing? And the medium-term budget is going in the opposite direction, loosening up. Loop structures in particular, I won't go into the details of it, but basically it's a way of moving money around in order to find the cheapest tax, to basically avoid paying tax in South Africa, essentially. So we're loosening up on those things rather than increasing them. I think I've got a couple more slides. Okay. So one journalist who did pick up on it on this medium-term budget move is Hilary Joffe. And she said, correctly, she said, at a time when determination is growing to halt illicit flows out of South Africa, which are estimated to be in the billions, and they are, one might have expected that the government might look to tighten controls at South Africa's financial borders and try to bring the money back instead of loosening these controls further. But she says the philosophy of South Africans regulators is that a more open regime makes it more likely that companies and individuals will move their money legally and pay their taxes. And she agrees with this, by the way. She's a kind of neoliberal business commentator. So basically the philosophy is be nice to monopoly capital and it will move money legally when it moves it out of the country, and it will pay its taxes, Yeah, okay. If pigs could fly. Right. So we're now in a dangerous conjuncture, okay? And I think we need to realize that. So in the past 2 weeks, Zuma has defied the state, walking out of the Zondo Commission. I think that's on a weak wicket. And I think obviously, the state is circling around him. But more worrying, okay, is that ACE defied the ANC and its explicit Nasrec resolution about stepping aside. And he's openly said that he intends to go to the branches with the April 2021 NGC as the key target, to say, basically, do you support me against this imperialist monopoly capital agenda against me? I'm innocent, okay. I was wondering what the NEC this coming weekend is going to say about that. And already the presidency has correctly said, ACE, the ANC presidency has correctly said that, ACE can't pick and choose what the branches have said. The branches have clearly said at Nasrec, they might have said that we need to nationalize the Reserve Bank and that we should have expropriation without compensation. But they also said that anyone in the ANC who's charged in the courts must step aside. But obviously there's selective interpretation. So I was wondering what the NEC, so I now see that Comrade Gwede Mantashe has said, well, actually the NEC can't force ACE to step aside because it's an individual decision. There's no legal grounds, although there's a decision to do that. Okay. So, once more, there's going to be a muddle along inside of the ANC, but clearly there are dangerous fissures opening up, and a shootout sooner or later is looming. And a big question is, will the ANC survive? And insofar, what, and if it does, in what form? Clearly, as the SACP, we want an ANC, a good ANC, or relatively good ANC, as to survive. And we are not going to work as the SACP to undermine the ANC. I believe, and I believe that's correct. But the Mail and Guardian on Friday was saying that in a shootout like this and at the NGC, it's ACE, they think, that might win with the financial and other support that he's got. So we must remember that these battles, okay, are not just ideological battles. In fact, they have very little to do with real ideology. They're battles of factions and tendencies, and both have significant financial muscle. Last couple of slides. Okay. Now, what about the SACP? Because we're correctly criticized often as the SACP, that we spend a lot of time analyzing the ANC, and why wouldn't we? Because it's such a critical reality. But what about us? And one of the key reasons originally impelling the ANC to promote a black capitalist class was the funding of an organization on the terrain of a capitalist society. Now, let's remember, and this has been a big challenge, okay, for progressive left parties all around the world, whether it's in Brazil or the UK, or whether it's Jeremy Corbyn in the UK or Bernie Sanders in the US or whatever, that in these multi-party capitalist-dominated electoral dispensations, elections, amongst other things, are incredibly expensive. I mean, what was the CR17 internal campaign within the ANC was said, I forget the exact figure, but it was of the order of 50 million rand was spent on an internal campaign, okay. So democracy in bourgeois-dominated democracies, multi-party democracy, is a very expensive reality, okay. So the ANC's attempt to, I think, problematic attempt to have a black capitalist class was not without some legitimacy. There's understanding for why it was done. So the question then is, how do we, as the SACP, sustain the party financially? Okay. So I'm not revealing secrets to the non-party comrades, and there are a couple on the chat, and I welcome them on the Zoom. Basically, the party's attempt to self-fund was through the debit orders, okay? And that has been an important source of funding and resourcing for the party. But it's never covered our monthly expenditures. And with the impact of COVID and more retrenchments amongst our membership and so on, the situation will have become more problematic. We've had historic support from trade unions, often generous support, but it's unreliable. Okay, it's often. Sorry, I'm not. Okay, it's often reliable. There'll be a chance to disagree if there's a disagreement that's coming. So there's been generous support from trade unions, not from COSATU any longer, from some of the affiliates, absolutely. There has been from time to time support from capitalists who are black. I'm not aware of too many white capitalists who've supported South Africa. And that's mainly been because, for instance, those aligning themselves with the CR17, for instance, campaign against the terrible wreckage of the Gupta years, saw the SACP as an important factor inside of the ANC itself and within the alliance and within the broader society. And so, we got some support then. But it's for that agenda rather than obviously for supporting the SACP per se. Then, we need to think about the sociology of the SACP. So we've got a national and provincial and even probably district leadership cadre, most of whom survive as ministers, deputy ministers, MPs, MPRs, mayors, councillors, public servants, and so forth. And they're supported by another layer of leadership in offices and things who are terribly underpaid, often not paid from month to month, as Solly and others will tell you, and under huge pressures. So for a lot of our national leadership, the way in which we're able to sustain them, and it's good that they're deployed into the ANC or into government and things like that, because hopefully they're making a positive contribution there. But it does mean that a lot of our leadership, SACP work is not the very little time. I think of, it's invidious to mention names, but I think of someone like Comrade Yunus Karim, who's an outstanding MP, got relegated in the ANC list process to out of the National Assembly into the NCOP, is playing a huge role there, is very active, is a very good MP, and therefore has very little time for the SACP and gives a lot of time. Okay, so we've got a challenge there, which relates partly to the funding and partly to the sociology. Then we've got a mass membership. Okay, it's over 300,000. The great majority, unless I'm very much mistaken, are young, and that's a huge asset. Very few communist parties around the world have a strong youth profile. But a great majority of them, like young people in South Africa in general, are unemployed. Okay, so that means that they, in terms of debit orders and resourcing and so forth, can't be expected to provide resourcing to the party. But in addition to that, what has been their political experience as we confront these big challenges that we've got in 2020 going into the future? And I suggest that largely the experience is of electoral politics, okay? They've come through SRCs, PYA structures, also ANC branches, and so forth. And so their experience is often very shaped by, and then activism in national, as Red Brigades and so on, in national elections and local elections and by-elections and so on. And so I venture to say that there's less community and shop floor organizational and campaigning experience throughout our party movement. Partly there's not the time, partly it's not the political education through practice and organization that we're getting. I'm making generalizations, and I hope comrades will correct me or nuance what I'm saying. I think I'm coming to the very last slide. Okay. So discussion points. So am I right to portray, or are we right, because it's not just me, to portray the dominant vectors at play within the ANC as being between a kind of third way, neoliberal light, somewhat compradorist tendency on the one hand, and a parasitic ority tendency on the other. That isn't the whole story of the ANC, but are those the dominant motive forces, if you like, at play within the ANC? What about the trajectories within the organized working class? I haven't spent time here, I haven't had time in this input. But I think we need to note that there's been a massive neoliberal rollback of the working class. I mean, through going back to the mid-1990s, retrenchments, casualization, labor brokering, informalization, and so on, which has placed unions massively on the defensive. And when on the defensive, got into internal battles within unions, but also in cannibalizing membership of other unions. And I think that a lot of the story around SAFTU, NUMSA, and its break with COSATU and its affiliates has to do with the pressures under which unions are under, and the temptations to cannibalize and so forth. And then we all know that there's a lot of factionalism related also then to various forms of BEE and business unionism and so on. The main exception to unions being largely on the defensive is the public sector, because ironically, the public sector has had a better employer by and large, not the municipalities perhaps, but generally through much of the civil service. But of course now, predictably, they are the primary focus of the neoliberal attack. Okay. And then what about the SACP? What is, and it's a point that I've already made, what is the social composition of the party? A leadership cadre with tenuous positions within the state, and within ANC leadership structures, and a mass membership, overwhelmingly useful and unemployed, but with an experience of effective mass campaigning and so on. So in this context, what do we actually mean by reconfiguring the alliance? Okay, what do we mean by a left progressive front or fronts? Practically, will these be resourced in ways that don't make them open to other people's strategic agendas? So I've taken much longer than I intended, far longer than I intended.